The words hit me before I could even settle into my chair. Miranda Harcourt Webb stood at the head of the conference table, her designer suit crisp, her expression rehearsed, her voice carrying that particular brand of cruelty that only people born into power seem to master. Let me be very clear, since you seem confused about your position here, you're not family. You never were. And this little performance you've been doing for 15 years? It's over. I didn't flinch. I'd learned long ago that flinching only encourages people like Miranda. Instead, I kept my hands folded on the mahogany table, the same table I'd helped Edmund select 23 years ago, back when this company occupied a single floor and dreams were still bigger than egos. Around me, 6 executives sat frozen in their expensive chairs. Some studied their tablets with theatrical intensity. Others exchanged glances that confirmed what I already knew. This moment had been choreographed long before the meeting invite appeared in my inbox. The firing squad had assembled, and I was supposed to crumble. Clean out your desk by 5. Security will escort you. And don't even think about contacting any of our clients. You signed an NDA, remember? Miranda's voice dripped with manufactured authority, the kind you develop when your last name opens every door, and your actual competence has never been tested. She was 31 years old, had been at Harcourt Industries for exactly 8 months, and genuinely believed that her MBA and her uncle's favoritism qualified her to dismantle everything I'd spent 15 years building. I let the silence stretch. I watched the slight uncertainty flicker behind her confident expression, that tiny moment when bullies realize their target isn't behaving the way victims are supposed to behave. My name is Vivian Ashford. I'm 43 years old. Until this moment, I held the title of Senior Director of Client Relations, a deliberately vague position that masked my actual function as the invisible architecture holding this entire company together. For 15 years, I've been the person who remembered every client's birthday, their children's names, their preferred wine at dinner meetings, their spouse's food allergies, and the precise tone of voice that signals when a negotiation is about to collapse. I'm the one who stayed until midnight fixing proposals that executives with corner offices had destroyed with their carelessness. I built the template for every major contract this company uses. I personally manage relationships with the 3 legacy clients who account for 47% of annual revenue. But none of that appears on any org chart. None of it shows up in board presentations. None of it was ever credited, documented, or acknowledged by anyone whose last name wasn't Harcourt. Edmund understood. Edmund always understood. But Edmund has been dead for 6 years, and the people who inherited his company inherited only the title, never the wisdom that built it. What Miranda doesn't know, what no one in this glass-walled conference room on the 34th floor knows, is that I'm not just an employee. I never was. I stood slowly, deliberately, letting them watch me gather my single folder with the calm precision of someone who has already calculated every possible outcome. I smoothed my jacket, not designer, never designer, because Edmund taught me that visible wealth attracts the wrong kind of attention in corporate environments. I understand completely, I said, my voice perfectly level. I'll be out within the hour. Miranda's expression flickered again. She'd expected tears, perhaps begging, maybe threats. The corporate termination playbook usually produces some combination of those responses. My compliance was somehow more unsettling than resistance would have been. I walked toward the door, feeling the weight of 6 pairs of eyes on my back. 15 years of service, reduced to a 90-second execution. 15 years of holding this company together while people with the right last names collected bonuses for my work. I paused at the threshold. I didn't turn around. I simply let my voice carry back into the room with the same calm clarity I'd used for every client presentation, every crisis resolution, every quiet repair of damage caused by people who never noticed I was fixing their mistakes. Miranda? You might want to check the original charter documents, the ones from 1987, before your uncle became CEO. I walked out before I could see her reaction. I didn't need to see it. I already knew what was coming, and I had waited 15 years for exactly this moment. The hallway stretched before me, familiar as my own reflection. I'd walked this path thousands of times past the corner offices I helped design but was never offered, past the break room where junior associates gathered to gossip about executives, past the conference rooms where my ideas had been presented by other people's voices. I let my fingers trail along the wall as I walked. This building held my fingerprints everywhere, invisible as I had always been. Every system that functioned smoothly, every relationship that endured through leadership transitions, every crisis that was averted before it reached executive attention, my work, my architecture, my invisible foundation. Edmund Harcourt hired me when I was 28. I was a junior liaison, fresh from a state school nobody had heard of, with student loans that felt like a mortgage and a wardrobe assembled from clearance racks. He saw something in me that his own children couldn't understand, or maybe just didn't want to see. "You're the architect nobody notices until the building falls down," he told me once, late at night, when we were the only two people still working in a company that hadn't yet learned to take success for granted. That's not an insult, Vivian. That's the highest compliment I know how to give. I believed him. I still believe him. The problem is that architects who remain invisible also remain unprotected when new owners decide to renovate without checking the blueprints. Edmund died 6 years ago. Cancer. The quick kind that doesn't give you time to say everything you meant to say. His son, Richard, took over as CEO because that's what happens in family companies. Blood trumps competence every single time. Richard kept me because I made his life easier. He never questioned why his calendar always seemed to arrange itself perfectly, why client complaints resolved before he heard about them, why quarterly reviews consistently exceeded projections despite his complete lack of strategic vision. He simply assumed I was another piece of furniture that came with the office, useful, replaceable, forgettable. The slow rot started almost immediately after Edmund's death. Richard brought in his wife's nephew to run marketing, a 26-year-old who thought viral meant successful and couldn't distinguish between engagement and revenue. His sister's son became VP of operations despite having no operations experience and a business degree purchased with family donations. And then Miranda arrived. Richard's niece from his late brother's side, armed with an MBA from a school that Richard's contributions helped fund, carrying the absolute certainty that her family connection entitled her to control everything her grandfather built. The actual work, the client relationships, the contract structures, the institutional knowledge remained on my shoulders. I was the load-bearing wall hidden behind decorative plaster, but credit flowed upward, always upward, to people with the right last name and the right connections and the right willingness to take what others had earned. I reached my office, my modest office, deliberately modest, tucked into a corner far from the executive floor. It had been moved 3 times in 6 years, each move taking me further from the center of power, each move shrinking my square footage. I understood the message perfectly. You are being systematically erased. But erasure requires the erased party's cooperation. It requires them to accept the new narrative, to internalize their own diminishment, to quietly disappear the way inconvenient employees are supposed to disappear. I sat at my desk and opened the drawer that held 15 years of accumulated evidence of my own invisibility. A photo of Edmund and me at the company's 25th anniversary gala, his arm around my shoulders, his smile genuine in a way his children's smiles never were. A pen he gave me when I closed my first major client, engraved with initials that aren't mine because he'd ordered it for himself and then decided I deserved it more. A copy of the company charter I helped draft when we restructured in 2003, back when we still meant Edmund and me, working late while the people who would eventually inherit everything slept soundly in their expensive homes. I touched the photo gently. "They finally made their move, Edmund," I whispered. "Which means it's time for me to make mine." Sudden, my phone buzzed, messages flooding in from colleagues expressing shock, offering hollow condolences, one from a junior associate asking who would handle the Pemberton account now that I was gone, another from Trevor Okonkwo in legal, awkwardly apologizing and asking if I remembered where the original Whitfield contract files were stored. I didn't respond. They would all discover the answers to their questions soon enough. Instead, I opened my bag and withdrew a worn leather folder. The leather was soft with age, creased from years of careful handling. Embossed on the cover were initials that weren't mine. E. H. Edmund Harcourt. Inside was a document dated 1987, 3 years before Harcourt Industries went public. Edmund's signature at the bottom, witnessed by two attorneys whose names I'd memorized long ago. The words silent equity provision were visible at the top of the first page, followed by dense legal language that most people wouldn't bother to read. Most people weren't me. I slid the folder into my bag, gathered the few personal items worth taking, and walked out of Harcourt Industries for what everyone believed was the last time. You learn something, working invisibly for 15 years. You learn exactly where the load-bearing walls are. And you learn what happens when someone tries to remove them without checking the blueprints first. My townhouse sits in a neighborhood that executives from Harcourt Industries have never visited, too modest, too far from the approved zip codes, where success is supposed to live. I chose it deliberately 18 years ago because Edmund taught me that the best power is power nobody suspects you have. The drive home took 47 minutes. I used every one of them to think, to plan, to feel the full weight of what had just happened without letting it crush me. 15 years. 15 years of early mornings and late nights. 15 years of remembering every detail that made clients feel valued. 15 years of cleaning up messes created by people who earned 3 times my salary. 15 years of being told, in 1,000 small ways, that my contributions didn't matter because my last name wasn't on the building. And now, a cardboard box on my passenger seat. My entire professional identity reduced to a photo, a pen, and documents that would make Miranda Harcourt Webb very uncomfortable if she ever bothered to read them. I parked in my driveway and sat for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel. The house looked the same as it had this morning when I left for what I thought would be an ordinary Tuesday. The garden needed weeding. The porch light I'd been meaning to replace still flickered intermittently. Normal. Everything looked normal, but nothing would be normal again. I carried the box inside and set it on my kitchen table. Then I made myself a cup of tea Earl Grey, the same blend Edmund used to keep in his office, and sat down to process what had happened. The termination itself didn't surprise me. I'd watched Miranda eliminate everyone who remembered how the company used to operate, everyone who had institutional knowledge she couldn't control, everyone who might question her authority based on actual experience. I was the last remaining connection to Edmund's vision, and she needed me gone before she could fully reshape the company in her own image. What surprised me was how precisely she'd misunderstood who I was. Miranda saw a middle-aged woman in sensible shoes, someone who'd been at the company forever without advancing, someone whose title didn't reflect any real power. She saw an administrator, a relationship manager, a glorified assistant who'd somehow accumulated responsibilities without earning authority. She never asked why Edmund's original contract still required my signature as witness. She never wondered why the 3 legacy clients' families who had been doing business with Harcourt Industries since before she was born always asked about me specifically when they called. She never questioned why her grandfather had established a separate trust, apart from the family trust, with provisions she'd never been told about. She assumed I was forgettable because I'd spent 15 years making myself easy to overlook. She didn't understand that invisibility was a choice, not a limitation. My phone buzzed again. More messages from colleagues. More hollow sympathy. But one message caught my attention. Douglas Pemberton. Vivian. Call me when you have a moment, it's important. Douglas Pemberton was 70 years old, the patriarch of Pemberton Manufacturing, and Harcourt Industries' largest client since 1989. He'd been Edmund's college roommate. Their companies had grown together. Their families had vacationed together. Their partnership had survived market crashes and industry transformations and leadership transitions. Douglas Pemberton was also the person who would determine whether Miranda's strategic vision survived its first major test. I didn't call him back. Not yet. First, I needed to make a different call. Pauline Cheng answered on the second ring. I was wondering when I'd hear from you. Pauline had been my attorney for 12 years. Edmund introduced us. Back when he first started planning for contingencies his family didn't know existed. She was 72 now, technically retired, but she'd made an exception for this particular client relationship. They made their move, I said. Miranda terminated me this morning. Cited relationship restructuring and strategic alignment. Bold. Pauline's voice carried the dry amusement of someone who had seen corporate arrogance implode countless times. Did she read the charter first? She's never read the charter. Neither has Richard. They don't even know where the original documents are stored. But you do. I wrote half of them. Silence stretched between us, comfortable and purposeful. Pauline understood the situation without needing explanation. We'd discussed this possibility years ago, when Edmund first told me what he was planning. It's time, I finally said. They're making their move, which means I need to make mine. I've had the documents ready for 6 years, Viv. I was starting to wonder if you'd ever call. I smiled despite everything. I was hoping I wouldn't need to. I was hoping they'd be smart enough to leave things alone. Hope is not a strategy. Edmund knew that. So do you. She was right. Edmund had always been right about the way power works in family companies. The children believe they're entitled to inherit success without understanding what created it. They see the building but never notice the foundation. They assume everything will continue functioning even after they remove the people who keep it running. The Ashford silent equity provision, I said. It's still valid? Valid and properly filed. 3% of original equity tied to Edmund's personal trust, with voting rights that have never been exercised because you've never needed to exercise them. And the trust itself? 12% of company shares, held separately from the family trust. You're the sole trustee with full voting authority. Edmund made sure of that. I closed my eyes, letting the reality sink in. 15%. Combined with my personal stake and the trust Edmund left in my control, I held 15% of Harcourt Industries, more than enough to swing any contested board decision, more than enough to trigger provisions that Miranda didn't know existed. There's something else, Pauline continued. The Pemberton family called me this morning. They're asking about their annual contract renewal, and they specifically asked if you still work there. Of course they did. Douglas Pemberton had known me for 30 years. He'd watched me grow from a nervous junior liaison into the person who managed his family's most important business relationship. He'd trusted me with information he didn't share with his own board of directors. And now he'd learned that Miranda Harcourt Webb had decided I was disposable. What did you tell him? I asked. I told him the truth, that you're no longer employed by Harcourt Industries, and that the situation is more complicated than anyone at that company currently understands. How did he respond? He laughed. Then he said, and I quote, Edmund always did enjoy a good chess game. I suppose Vivian learned from the best. I opened my eyes. Through my kitchen window, the afternoon sun was painting golden patterns across the familiar landscape of my quiet life. Somewhere across the city, Miranda Harcourt Webb was probably celebrating her victory, congratulating herself on eliminating the last obstacle to her complete control. She had no idea what she'd set in motion. Set up a meeting, I told Pauline. Not at your office, somewhere private. And pull together everything we've got. I want to understand exactly where we stand before I decide how to proceed. There's one more thing you should know, Pauline said. The bankruptcy filing. I felt my stomach tighten. What bankruptcy filing? Miranda is preparing to file for Harcourt Holdings, the subsidiary that controls the legacy client contracts. Restructuring, she's calling it. Eliminating outdated relationship provisions. Consolidating control under her new strategic framework, Harcourt Holdings. Edmund had created that entity specifically to protect founding client relationships from exactly this kind of maneuvering. It contained provisions, safeguards, and approval requirements that Miranda had clearly never bothered to read. Does she understand what she's trying to restructure? I asked. I doubt she understands anything beyond her own ambition, but that filing requires approval from all founding stakeholders. And the founding stakeholder registry isn't exactly complete. I set down my tea. The quiet afternoon had suddenly become something else entirely. A battlefield taking shape, chess pieces moving into position, consequences accumulating for people who had never learned to look before they leaped. The competency clause, I said, in Appendix C, still valid, still enforceable. If any 3 founding clients formally express loss of confidence in company leadership, a founding stakeholder with at least 2% equity can call a vote of no confidence in current executives. 3 founding clients. The Pemberton family, who had just called asking about me. The Whitfield family, whose contract renewal Miranda had dismissed as routine resistance to change. The Marchetti Group, whose annual dinner tradition Miranda had canceled as an unnecessary expense, Edmund had built tripwires throughout his company's foundational documents. He'd anticipated that his family would eventually overreach. He'd made sure that someone would have the tools to protect what he'd built when that moment arrived. He just hadn't told me I'd be the one using them. "I need time to think," I said. "This is bigger than I anticipated. Take all the time you need. They're not going anywhere except possibly off a cliff they don't see coming." After Pauline hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen and let myself feel the full weight of what I'd learned. 15 years of invisibility, 15 years of waiting. And now, suddenly, the game had changed in ways no one at Harcourt Industries could possibly anticipate. Maybe you know what this feels like. Maybe you've been the person who keeps everything running while someone else takes the credit and the corner office. Maybe you've smiled through meetings where your ideas came out of someone else's mouth. Maybe you've been passed over, overlooked, underestimated so many times that you started to wonder if you were the one who was wrong. I used to wonder that too. I used to lie awake at night, questioning whether my invisible contributions actually mattered or whether I was just telling myself stories to make the indignity bearable. But Edmund knew. Edmund saw. And Edmund built a safety net for the day when his family would finally try to cut the rope. I reached into my bag and pulled out the worn leather folder. Inside, behind the equity provision, was another document one I'd almost forgotten existed. A letter, handwritten in Edmund's distinctive script, dated 1 month before his death. I didn't open it. Not yet. Some revelations need to wait until the moment is right. Instead, I called Douglas Pemberton. The following week at Harcourt Industries unfolded exactly as I'd anticipated, though watching from a distance made it somehow more satisfying than being present would have been. Miranda Harcourt Webb was triumphant. She'd finally removed the last obstacle to her complete control of client relations, that quiet woman who always seemed to know too much and say too little. She'd never trusted my calm demeanor, my unreadable expressions, my way of being present in every important room without ever demanding attention. People like Miranda are always suspicious of people like me. We make them uncomfortable in ways they can't articulate. We seem to know things without being told, to anticipate problems before they emerge, to understand systems at a level that feels almost threatening to those who've never had to learn how anything actually works. Richard Harcourt, my former CEO, was relieved by my departure. He'd never understood what I actually did, only that I made him uncomfortable. I knew things about the company's history that he'd never bothered to learn. I had relationships with clients who sometimes called me directly instead of going through proper channels. My presence reminded him that he'd inherited something he hadn't built, and nobody likes being reminded of their own inadequacy. My removal simplified his org chart and pleased his niece, which is what family leadership is all about when you've never had to earn anything in your life. I learned about Miranda's first major mistake through Douglas Pemberton, who called me 3 days after my termination with barely contained amusement in his voice. "She called me this morning," Douglas said. "Your replacement. Your delightfully aggressive replacement." What did she say? She mentioned synergies. She talked about optimization. She used the phrase streamlined engagement protocols without any apparent irony. Douglas paused, and I could hear the smile in his silence. Then she suggested renegotiating our contract terms to, quote, reflect current market dynamics. I closed my eyes. Miranda had made her first move, and it was exactly the wrong one. The Pemberton contract contained provisions that Edmund had insisted on, provisions that protected both parties from exactly this kind of aggressive renegotiation by requiring approval from founding stakeholders for any material changes. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I asked where you were. She said you were no longer with the company, and that she was personally overseeing all strategic client relationships now. She assured me the transition would be seamless." And then Douglas's voice shifted, carrying the weight of 30 years of partnership. "I told her I've been doing business with Harcourt Industries since before she was born, that in 34 years, exactly one person at that company has understood what partnership actually means, and that she just told me that person was gone." How did she respond? She didn't. She stammered something about modernization and hung up. "Vivian, what exactly is happening over there?" I considered my answer carefully. Douglas deserved the truth, but the truth was complicated, and timing mattered more than transparency at this particular moment. Edmund built safeguards, I finally said, for exactly this kind of situation. He knew his family would eventually overreach. He made preparations. What kind of preparations? The kind that require patience, and the kind that require the other side to keep making mistakes until the case builds itself. Douglas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried something I'd rarely heard from him: respect mixed with what might have been awe. Edmund told me, years ago, that if anything ever happened to him, I should trust you. He said you'd know what to do when the time came. I didn't understand what he meant then. Do you understand now? I'm starting to. What do you need from me? Nothing yet. Let them keep building the case against themselves. I've waited 15 years. I can wait a few more weeks. 3 weeks passed while I gathered intelligence and let Miranda's mistakes accumulate. The private club where I met Douglas Pemberton occupied the top floor of a building that most of Seattle didn't know existed. Edmund Harcourt had been a founding member. I'd maintained my membership using funds from Edmund's trust, attending rarely, but keeping my access current for exactly this kind of situation. Douglas sat across from me in a leather chair that probably cost more than my first car. Around us, other members conducted quiet conversations in spaces designed for discretion: old money talking to old money, decisions being made that would never appear in any official record. It's worse than I thought, Douglas said, sliding a folder across the table. The Whitfields called me yesterday, and the Marchettis the day before. I opened the folder. Inside were copies of emails, meeting notes, phone transcripts, the kind of documentation that families like the Pembertons and Whitfields and Marchettis maintained without corporate attorneys ever knowing it existed. What happened? Miranda's been busy. She dismissed the Whitfields' request for a meeting about their concerns regarding the new operational leadership, called it, quote, routine resistance to change. I nodded, unsurprised. Miranda had never understood that legacy clients aren't just revenue sources. They're partnerships built on decades of personal trust, maintained through careful attention to concerns that might seem minor to outsiders, but carry enormous weight to the people involved. And the Marchettis? She canceled the annual dinner. The one Edmund started in 1997, the one your company has hosted every year for 27 consecutive years. Miranda called it an unnecessary expense. The annual Marchetti dinner. I'd planned every one of them since 2003. I knew Antonio Marchetti's favorite wine, his wife's dietary restrictions, the particular style of music that reminded him of his father's house in Tuscany. I knew that the dinner wasn't about business at all. It was about honoring a relationship that had survived language barriers and cultural differences and 30 years of building trust across continents. Miranda saw a line item. She didn't see the 30 years of human connection that line item represented. Each error on its own is manageable, I said, thinking out loud. But combined, they've activated provisions in contracts that I suspect Miranda has never read. I looked up from the folder. You know about the provisions? Douglas smiled. Vivian, I helped Edmund write them. Back in 1992, when he was worried about what would happen to his company after he was gone. He wanted safeguards, real ones, not the kind that lawyers create to look impressive and then never enforce. Relationship continuity standards? I said. Exactly. If 3 founding clients formally express concern about leadership's handling of their partnerships, they can request a formal review of company leadership. And if a founding stakeholder with sufficient equity supports that request, the competency clause kicks in. Douglas leaned forward, his expression shifting from amused to serious. What do you want me to do, Vivian? Edmund trusted you. That means I trust you. But I need to understand what we're building toward. I considered the question carefully. What did I want? Revenge. Certainly the cold satisfaction of watching people who dismissed me finally understand their mistake. But revenge wasn't enough. It wasn't what Edmund would have wanted, and it wasn't what the company needed. I want to be in the room when they finally read the full charter, I said. All of it, including the pages they don't know exist. And after that, we'll see what kind of people they really are. If they're smart enough to recognize what they've done wrong and humble enough to change course, maybe we find a path forward together. If they're not, If they're not, I met Douglas's eyes. Then we do what Edmund built us to do. We protect what he created from the people who inherited it without understanding it. Douglas nodded slowly. The Whitfields and Marquettis are waiting for my signal. Harrison Whitfield has already drafted his letter of concern. Antonio Marchetti is ready to submit his as soon as I give the word. Not yet. Let Miranda file her bankruptcy restructuring first. Let her put her arrogance on official record. The bigger the overreach, the harder the correction. And the bankruptcy filing? Has she submitted it? The paperwork is being finalized. My sources say she's planning to file next week. I smiled, the first real smile I'd allowed myself since walking out of that conference room. Perfect. The bankruptcy filing is exactly what we need. Why? Because it requires approval from all founding stakeholders. And the founding stakeholder registry isn't quite as complete as Miranda believes it is. Douglas's eyebrows rose. Edmund's personal trust. 15% of company shares. Voting rights that have never been exercised because they've never needed to be exercised. A competency clause that can be activated by any stakeholder with at least 2% equity. And you hold 3% personally, plus 12% through the trust, enough to swing any contested decision, enough to trigger provisions that Miranda doesn't know exist. Douglas sat back in his chair, something like wonder crossing his face. Edmund planned this. All of it. From the very beginning. Edmund understood his family better than they ever understood themselves. He knew they'd eventually overreach. He just hoped it wouldn't happen in his lifetime. And he trusted you to handle it when it did. He trusted me to protect what he built. Whatever that requires. The silence stretched between us, comfortable and purposeful. Outside the club's windows, the city carried on with its ordinary business, unaware of the extraordinary game being played in quiet rooms by people who understood that real power never announces itself. 3 weeks, Douglas finally said. Let her file the bankruptcy. Let her demonstrate exactly how badly she's mishandled everything Edmund built. Then we move. Then we move. As I left the club that evening, I paused in the lobby to study a photograph hanging near the entrance. Edmund Harcourt and Douglas Pemberton, young men in the 1,970 seconds, standing in front of a building that no longer existed. Their smiles carried the confidence of people who believed they could build something lasting. Edmund had been right about so many things, but he'd been wrong about one. He thought I'd wait patiently until the moment required action. What he hadn't realized was that patience itself was the action. Every day I didn't react, every week I didn't strike back, I was allowing Miranda to build a case against herself, more comprehensive than any I could have constructed through direct confrontation. The revolution would be quiet, but it would be complete. Back at Harcourt Industries, the cracks were beginning to show in ways that made my absence more visible than my presence had ever been. I learned about the mounting chaos through Trevor Okonkwo, the head of legal, who called me 10 days after my termination, with barely concealed panic in his voice. Miss Ashford, Vivian, I hope you don't mind me calling. I found your personal number in an old file, and I didn't know who else to ask. I liked Trevor. He'd been hired after Edmund's death, which meant he wasn't part of the family network, wasn't beholden to the Harcourt name for his position. He was competent, careful, and increasingly alarmed by what he was discovering in documents that previous legal leadership had never bothered to examine. What's wrong, Trevor? The Whitfield contract renewal. It should have been routine. We've renewed that contract every 3 years since 1992 without any complications. But suddenly the family's attorneys are requesting copies of the original agreement, including all amendments, documents that no one here can locate. I allowed myself a small smile. The Whitfield archive system was my creation, a Byzantine filing structure that made perfect sense to anyone who understood the history behind each document and was virtually impenetrable to anyone who didn't. Have you checked the secondary storage facility in Bellevue? There's a secondary storage facility? Edmund established it in 2001 after the first office renovation displaced several filing cabinets. Original documents from founding clients are stored there, organized by relationship date rather than alphabetical order. Relationship date? The date of the first meeting between Edmund and the founding client. It's how Edmund thought about partnerships not by name, but by the moment the relationship began. Silence on Trevor's end. Then, how does anyone know which relationship started when? They ask me. Or they used to. Trevor exhaled heavily. That explains a lot. Miranda's been tearing apart the main filing system for 3 days looking for the Marchetti originals. She's convinced someone misfiled them deliberately to sabotage her. The Marchetti documents aren't in the main filing system. They never were. Edmund kept them in his personal office safe until the office was renovated. Then they were moved to the secondary facility along with the Pemberton and Whitfield originals. Why? Because Edmund understood that some relationships are too important to trust to standard organizational systems. He wanted those documents protected from the kind of careless reorganization that happens when new leadership decides to modernize without understanding what they're modernizing. Trevor was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted from panic to something more thoughtful. Vivian, I've been reviewing old documents, things from before my time here. And I've found references to provisions I don't remember, clauses about founding stakeholder rights and relationship continuity standards, language that doesn't appear in any of the documents Miranda has been working with. What specifically have you found? Signature requirements that don't match the current shareholder registry, references to entities I can't identify, and the bankruptcy filing Miranda is preparing. It requires approval from all founding stakeholders of Harcourt Holdings. But I can't find a complete list of who those stakeholders are. I let the silence stretch, considering how much to reveal. Trevor was smart, honest, and increasingly disturbed by what he was uncovering. He could be an ally or he could be a complication, depending on how he chose to respond to what he was learning. The registry shows the Harcourt family trust controls 61%, Trevor continued. Institutional investors hold 34%, but that's only 95%. Who holds the other 5? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked my own question. Trevor, when you took this job, did anyone explain the company's foundational history to you? The original charter, the founding stakeholder agreements, the provisions Edmund established before the IPO? I was given standard orientation materials, corporate history, organizational structure, current shareholder breakdown. Nothing about founding stakeholders or original charter provisions. Did anyone mention Edmund's personal trust? I didn't know there was a personal trust separate from the family trust. There is. And the trustee of that personal trust isn't listed in any company filing. Silence again. Then, who is the trustee? I think you already know the answer to that question, Trevor. I think that's why you're calling me instead of asking Miranda or Richard. More silence. When Trevor spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled, the voice of a lawyer who has just realized he's standing in the middle of a minefield. The document I found, from 1987. It establishes something called the Ashford Silent Equity Provision. It's tied to the Edmund Harcourt Personal Trust. Yes, the bankruptcy filing Miranda is preparing, if there are stakeholders who haven't been notified, the entire filing could be invalidated. If there are contractual provisions that haven't been honored, the company could face legal action from clients we can't afford to lose. Yes, Miss Ashford. Vivian. Trevor's voice carried the weight of someone reaching a decision. What exactly did you do at this company for 15 years? I considered my answer carefully. Trevor deserved the truth. He'd discovered it on his own. After all, but the truth had implications that neither of us could fully control once it was spoken aloud. I built the architecture that holds everything together, I finally said. The relationships, the contracts, the systems, the institutional knowledge. Edmund understood that companies aren't just legal structures, they're networks of human connections maintained through attention and care and consistency. I was his instrument for maintaining those connections. And the equity provision. Compensation for work that would never appear on payroll records. Edmund knew I'd never get credit for what I did. He wanted to make sure I got something more valuable than credit. Power. Exactly. Trevor exhaled slowly. The bankruptcy filing can't proceed without your approval. No, it can't. And Miranda doesn't know any of this. Miranda never asked, neither did Richard. They assumed I was furniture useful, replaceable, forgettable. They never wondered why their grandfather created separate legal structures to protect certain relationships. They never questioned why certain documents required certain signatures. They inherited a company without bothering to understand how it worked. What are you going to do? That depends on what they do. So far, they've made mistakes that are embarrassing but recoverable. If they file that bankruptcy without proper stakeholder approval, they'll cross a line that can't be uncrossed. And the founding clients? The Pemberton, Whitfield, and Marchetti families are watching very carefully. They've maintained relationships with this company for decades because they trusted Edmund's vision. They're waiting to see whether his successors deserve that same trust. Trevor was quiet for a long moment. Then, "What do you need from me?" "Nothing yet. Just keep doing your job, reviewing documents, asking questions, noting irregularities. When the time comes, there may be a role for someone with your position and your conscience. But I won't ask you to do anything that compromises your professional responsibilities. And if Miranda asks me about this conversation, tell her the truth. Tell her you called me to ask about the filing system. Tell her I explained how Edmund organized founding client documents. Tell her anything you want. Won't that warn her?" Miranda has been warned since the day she took over. She simply hasn't been listening. People like her never do. They're too confident in their own superiority to notice the evidence accumulating against them. After Trevor hung up, I sat in my quiet townhouse and considered the pieces on the board. Miranda was preparing her bankruptcy filing. The founding clients were preparing their letters of concern. Trevor was discovering the foundations he'd never known existed. And I was waiting, patient as architecture, until the moment when everything would finally come together. Miranda submitted her bankruptcy filing on a Tuesday morning, confident and triumphant. Harcourt Holdings, the subsidiary Edmund had created specifically to protect founding client relationships, would be restructured to eliminate outdated provisions and consolidate control under Miranda's new strategic framework. The filing was aggressive, thorough, and completely unaware of the tripwires it was about to trigger. Richard signed off without reading the details. The board was told it was routine restructuring. Everyone who mattered at Harcourt Industries believed this was the final step in modernizing a company weighed down by Edmund's outdated sentimentality. What they didn't anticipate was the response from the bankruptcy court. Within 72 hours, the Honorable Catherine Marchetti Ross scheduled an expedited hearing, citing irregularities in stakeholder notification. The name should have been a warning sign. Marchetti is not a common name in American judiciary circles, but Miranda was too focused on her victory to notice the connections she'd failed to research. Judge Marchetti Ross was the daughter of Antonio Marchetti, founder of the Marchetti Group. She'd grown up hearing stories about Edmund Harcourt and the American company that became her family's first international partnership. She'd learned about business ethics from a man who believed that honor mattered more than profit, and she had seen the name Ashford on documents her father kept in his personal files. I arrived at the courthouse early on the day of the hearing. I chose my outfit carefully, a simple navy suit, not designer but impeccably tailored. Around my neck, I wore a pendant Edmund had given me 15 years ago, bearing the original company logo that the current leadership had never seen. The courtroom was designed for corporate proceedings, functional, austere, utterly indifferent to the drama about to unfold within its walls. Miranda and Richard sat at the front table with their legal team, radiating the confidence of people who had never experienced serious opposition. They didn't notice me take my seat at the back of the room. Judge Marchetti Ross entered, and everyone rose. She was 63 years old, with the kind of gravitas that comes from decades of adjudicating disputes between people who believe their money entitles them to special treatment. She surveyed the courtroom with eyes that missed nothing. "This court is convened to consider the bankruptcy petition filed by Harcourt Industries on behalf of Harcourt Holdings," she announced. "Before we proceed to arguments, I have a procedural question." Miranda's legal team shifted, uncertain. Procedural questions at bankruptcy hearings were typically routine. Judge Marchetti Ross looked directly at the Harcourt table. "Can counsel confirm that all founding stakeholders of Harcourt Holdings, as defined in the 1987 Charter and subsequent amendments, have been properly notified of this filing?" Silence. The Harcourt attorneys exchanged glances. They didn't have a complete list. They had assumed the company registry was comprehensive. They hadn't anticipated anyone questioning the notification process. "Your Honor," the lead attorney began, "the company registry indicates—" "I didn't ask about the company registry. I asked about the 1987 charter. Are you telling me you haven't reviewed the foundational documents for the entity you're attempting to restructure? More silence. More exchanged glances. Judge Marchetti Ross picked up a document from her desk. I'm entering into the record an objection to this filing, submitted by a founding stakeholder whose notification rights appear to have been violated. Miranda's face went pale. Richard looked confused. The attorneys scrambled through their files as if the answer might somehow materialize. The objector is listed in the 1987 charter as a silent equity holder with specific approval rights over any restructuring that affects legacy client relationships. Judge Marchetti Ross looked toward the back of the courtroom. The objector's name is Vivian Ashford. Is Miss Ashford present? I stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room shift toward me. 15 years of invisibility, ending in a single moment of perfect visibility. I'm here, Your Honor. Miranda's expression was something I'll treasure for the rest of my life. The dawning realization that the woman she'd dismissed as forgettable had been holding cards she never knew existed. Miss Ashford, please approach. I walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, past the legal teams and the observers and the court reporters. I stopped at the appropriate distance from the bench and waited. Miss Ashford, do you confirm that you are a founding stakeholder of Harcourt Holdings as defined in the 1987 charter? I do, Your Honor. And do you confirm that you were not notified of this bankruptcy filing prior to its submission? I was not notified. I learned of the filing through public records. And what is your position regarding this restructuring? I object, Your Honor. The filing violates multiple provisions of the original charter, including requirements for unanimous approval of any changes affecting legacy client relationships. Judge Marchetti Ross nodded, unsurprised. She looked at Miranda, then at Richard, then back at me. Counsel, it appears this filing cannot proceed without Miss Kloss. Ashford's approval. Given the irregularities in notification, I'm ordering a 60-day stay and a full review of stakeholder rights. Your Honor, Miranda's attorney began. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell, and everything changed. The aftermath of the hearing was chaos, though I experienced it from a comfortable distance. I'd returned to my townhouse while Harcourt Industries descended into panic. Trevor called me twice that evening, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent hours in meetings with people who refuse to accept reality. They're demanding to know how this happened, Trevor said. Miranda keeps insisting it must be fraud, something you fabricated to take revenge for your termination. And what did you tell them? I told them I found the 1987 charter in the secondary storage facility in Bellevue. I showed them the Ashford silent equity provision. I explained that the documents are real, properly filed, and legally binding. How did they respond? Miranda accused me of being part of a conspiracy. Richard asked why no one told him about any of this. The outside directors sat in stunned silence and eventually left without speaking. I could picture it perfectly, the corner office chaos, the desperate scrambling, the inability to accept that years of arrogance had consequences. People like Miranda and Richard spent their lives believing that rules applied to others but not to them. Discovering otherwise was always traumatic. What happens now? Trevor asked. Now we wait for them to make more mistakes. People in crisis rarely make good decisions. They react instead of thinking. They defend instead of adapting. The next few weeks will determine whether this company can be saved or whether it needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. And you? What's your position in all of this? I'm a founding stakeholder with voting rights and specific approval authority. Nothing more, nothing less. Vivian, that's significantly more than nothing. Perhaps, but I've spent 15 years being invisible. I'm not interested in becoming the center of attention now. I'm interested in making sure Edmund's company survives the people who inherited it without earning it. The days that followed confirmed everything I'd anticipated about how the Harcourt family would respond to crisis. The Whitfield contract renewal, which should have been completed months ago, remained in limbo. The family's attorneys continued requesting documents that Harcourt's legal team couldn't locate, and Miranda's attempts to reassure them only deepened their concerns. The Marchetti group had gone completely silent. Emails went unanswered. Calls were returned by assistants who said the family was evaluating options. The annual dinner that Miranda had dismissed as unnecessary expense was now looking like the last moment when the relationship might have been salvaged. And the Pemberton family, the largest, most important founding client, had formally requested a meeting with the full board of directors, not to discuss their contract, but to discuss confidence in current leadership. Richard didn't understand why relationships that had existed for decades were suddenly complicated. He'd inherited those relationships along with everything else, and he'd assumed they would continue functioning without any effort on his part. Miranda blamed me, of course. She told anyone who would listen that I'd poisoned the founding client relationships on my way out, that I'd been too close to these families, that my departure had been unprofessional and my revenge was petty. What she couldn't explain was how I'd been close enough to poison those relationships while simultaneously being invisible enough to dismiss. The contradiction never seemed to occur to her. Trevor continued to serve as my primary source of intelligence, calling me daily with updates that painted an increasingly grim picture. The board is fracturing, he told me 10 days after the hearing. The outside directors are demanding a full governance review. 3 of them have already consulted personal attorneys about their potential liability. What about Richard and Miranda? Richard has retreated to his office. He's taking meetings only with family members and avoiding everyone else. Miranda is still trying to salvage the bankruptcy filing. She's convinced there must be some legal technicality that invalidates your objection. There isn't. I know, but she won't accept that. She's spent her entire life believing that family connections can solve any problem. The concept of structural limitations is foreign to her. I thought about what Edmund would say if he could see his company now, the chaos, the panic, the desperate scrambling of people who had inherited success without understanding what created it. He'd be disappointed. Certainly. But I didn't think he'd be surprised. There's something else, Trevor continued. The board is convening an emergency session to address the stakeholder crisis. They're asking if you'll attend not as a former employee, but as a founding stakeholder with voting rights. I'd been waiting for this. The invitation to participate wasn't generosity, it was desperation. They needed to understand what I wanted, so they could figure out how to negotiate their way out of the mess they'd created. Tell them I'll be there, I said, and tell them to make sure everyone reads the full charter first, including Appendix C. Appendix C? They'll find out soon enough. The emergency board session took place in Harcourt Industries' original boardroom, the one Edmund built, the one Richard had converted into storage years ago, but which I'd specified for this meeting. The room had been hastily cleaned, decades of accumulated boxes relocated to make space for the kind of confrontation that happens when families discover they don't actually control what they thought they owned. Around the table, Richard, Miranda, 4 outside directors who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, Trevor, and 2 family attorneys whose expressions suggested they'd already delivered bad news that hadn't been well received. At the far end of the table, alone, I sat waiting. The meeting began with Richard attempting to control the narrative. We're here to address a procedural issue with the bankruptcy filing. Once we resolve Miss Ashford's claims, we can proceed with the restructuring as planned. I said nothing. I simply slid a document across the table, Appendix C of the original charter, which I had personally drafted with Edmund in 1987. Richard picked it up, scanned it briefly, then looked at me with undisguised irritation. What is this supposed to prove? Read Section 4. He read. His face changed. The competency clause, I said quietly, giving him time to absorb what he was seeing. It states that if any 3 founding clients formally express loss of confidence in company leadership, a founding stakeholder with at least 2% equity can call a vote of no confidence in current executives. This is absurd, Miranda interrupted. You can't just... The Pemberton family submitted their loss of confidence letter this morning, I continued, ignoring her. The Whitfield family submitted theirs last week, citing concerns about leadership's handling of their contract review. The Marchetti Group submitted theirs directly to this board yesterday, expressing concern about the bankruptcy filing's impact on their legacy partnership. The silence that followed was absolute. 3 founding clients, 3 letters. As a founding stakeholder holding 3% equity, I'm formally invoking Appendix C, Section 4, No Confidence Review of Executive Leadership. The outside directors looked at each other. They'd never seen this document. They'd never known these provisions existed, and they were suddenly aware that the family members who had brought them onto this board might not have been entirely honest about who actually controlled this company. Richard's face had gone white. Miranda was scrolling through her phone, texting attorneys, seeking some escape that didn't exist. Trevor was the only one who didn't look surprised. He'd been preparing for this moment since our first phone conversation, and I sat at the end of the table, exactly as I had for 15 years, calm, patient, and completely in control. "This can't be legal," Miranda said, her voice carrying the desperation of someone whose certainty was crumbling. "You're a former employee with a grudge. You can't just manufacture documents and claim, 'I didn't manufacture anything.'" I kept my voice level, professional. These documents were drafted in 1987, reviewed by independent legal counsel, properly filed with the state, and registered with the company's foundational records. The fact that you never bothered to read them doesn't make them invalid. My grandfather would never have given this kind of power to someone who isn't family. I met Miranda's eyes without flinching. "Your grandfather understood something you've never learned. Competence doesn't care about bloodlines. Loyalty doesn't come automatically with a last name. He built this company with people he trusted, not people he was related to." "And he trusted you?" Miranda's voice dripped with contempt. "A relationship manager? A glorified assistant? He trusted me enough to give me 15% voting control of his company. He trusted me enough to name me as the safeguard against exactly this kind of situation." I paused, letting the words sink in. "The question isn't whether he trusted me. The question is whether you've given this board any reason to trust you." The no confidence vote couldn't be delayed. Appendix C specified that once invoked, the vote must occur within 48 hours, and it required a 2/3 majority of total equity to pass. Richard believed he was safe. The family trust controlled 61%. Even if every outside investor voted against him, he had the numbers to survive. But Richard had miscalculated. The Edmund Harcourt Personal Trust, the one that held my equity provision, also held 12% of company shares that Edmund separated from the family trust before his death. That trust had voting rights, and those rights were controlled by the designated trustee. The designated trustee was me. When the vote was called, the numbers shifted in ways Richard hadn't anticipated. Family trust, 61% for confidence. Institutional investors, 34% split roughly evenly. Edmund's personal trust, 15% against confidence. The arithmetic was devastating. With institutional investors splitting their votes and the personal trust voting against confidence, the motion failed, not by a narrow margin, by 8%. A decisive, undeniable rejection of everything Richard and Miranda had represented. The room erupted. Miranda screamed about fraud, about theft, about conspiracies orchestrated by a bitter former employee. Richard demanded proof that the trust designation was valid, that my authority was real, that any of this was legally enforceable. Trevor produced the document signed by Edmund Harcourt, notarized, filed with the state 6 months before his death. It named Vivian Ashford as sole trustee of the Edmund Harcourt Personal Trust, with full voting authority over all shares held therein. The outside directors, realizing they'd been misled about shareholder control for years, immediately called for a formal leadership review. 3 of them resigned their positions on the spot, citing material misrepresentation of company governance. The company Edmund built was coming apart at the seams, and the people who had inherited it were watching helplessly as their assumed authority crumbled. As the meeting descended into chaos, I stood and walked toward the door. I'd done what I came to do. The rest would take care of itself. Richard called after me. "What do you want? What is this about?" I stopped at the threshold, but I didn't turn around. I let my voice carry back into the room with 15 years of accumulated patience. This was never about what I want. It's about what Edmund wanted. And Edmund wanted the company he built to be run by people who understand what partnership means. I walked out without waiting for a response. The following weeks transformed Harcourt Industries in ways that would have seemed impossible months earlier. Richard was asked to step down as CEO pending a full governance review. The request wasn't phrased as optional. The remaining board members, the institutional investors, and the founding stakeholders had unified around a simple principle: The current leadership had demonstrated catastrophic judgment, and change was necessary. Miranda was terminated for cause. Her failed bankruptcy filing, her mishandling of legacy client relationships, her systematic dismissal of institutional knowledge, all of it constituted breach of fiduciary duty. She was offered severance in exchange for a clean departure, and after her attorneys reviewed the alternative, which involved prolonged litigation and public exposure of her failures, she accepted. The three family-appointed executives who had populated leadership positions without qualifications were either reassigned to non-strategic roles or offered packages to leave quietly. Most chose to leave. They'd never been genuinely interested in the work anyway, only in the titles and the access. Douglas Pemberton, Antonio Marchetti, and Harrison Whitfield issued a joint statement expressing confidence in Harcourt Industries' new direction and committing to extended partnership agreements. Their support wasn't unconditional, it came with expectations about governance, accountability, and respect for the relationships their families had maintained for decades. But it was enough. It was more than enough. The board appointed an interim CEO, not me. Though the position was offered, I declined. I'd spent 15 years in the background, and I'd discovered that was exactly where I belonged. Leadership wasn't about titles or corner offices, it was about influence, relationships, and the ability to shape outcomes without needing public recognition. Instead, they appointed Trevor Okonkwo. He'd demonstrated integrity during the crisis, possessed the legal expertise to oversee the governance restructuring, and perhaps most importantly, he'd shown the capacity to ask questions rather than simply accepting the answers he was given. My role was formalized in a different way. I became chair of the newly created Legacy Partnership Council, with oversight authority over founding client relationships and veto power over any executive decisions that affected long-term stakeholder agreements. It wasn't a title I'd asked for, it was a structure Edmund had designed years ago, waiting to be activated when his family inevitably overreached. The pendant he'd given me, bearing the original company logo, now hung in my new office, not a corner office, but a comfortable space near the center of the building, where I could see everything without being constantly visible. At the press conference, announcing the leadership changes, a reporter asked Richard Harcourt for comment. His response was captured on camera, shared across business news networks, and analyzed by commentators who found it remarkable for its complete lack of self-awareness. My father made a mistake, trusting someone outside the family with that kind of power. I watched the clip from my office, alone, and allowed myself a small smile. Edmund would have known exactly what to say to that. He would have pointed out that trust isn't a mistake when it's placed in someone who proves worthy of it. He would have observed that family loyalty becomes a liability when it blinds you to the contributions of people whose last names don't match yours. But Edmund wasn't here to say those things. So I just sat in my quiet office, watching the sun set over the city he'd loved, and let the irony speak for itself. Months passed, and my new life settled into patterns that felt both different and familiar. I still arrived early. I still knew every founding client's birthday, their children's accomplishments, their concerns about market conditions and partnership continuity. I still wrote the first draft of every major proposal before anyone else saw it. The difference was subtle but profound. Now, when I spoke in meetings, people wrote down what I said. Now, when I raised concerns about strategic direction, those concerns were addressed rather than dismissed. Now, when credit was distributed for successful outcomes, my name appeared alongside the others who had contributed. It shouldn't have mattered. I'd spent 15 years operating without recognition, finding satisfaction in the work itself rather than the acknowledgement. But there was something healing about being seen, something restorative about having my contributions reflected back to me by people who understood their value. I thought about that healing often, particularly on quiet mornings when the office was empty and I had time to reflect. The cost of my journey had been significant years of invisibility, accumulated slights, constant vigilance required to maintain competence in an environment that rewarded connection over contribution. I developed a thick skin not because I was naturally resilient, but because the alternative was being worn away entirely. But I'd also gained things that couldn't be measured on balance sheets or org charts. Clarity about my own worth. Relationships built on genuine mutual respect rather than obligatory professional courtesy. The knowledge that I'd honored Edmund's trust in me, that I'd protected what he built when his own family tried to destroy it. And I'd learned something about power that I wished I'd understood earlier. Real power isn't about titles or visibility. Real power is about understanding systems well enough to protect the people who depend on them. On a cool autumn morning, I visited Edmund's grave for the first time since his funeral. The cemetery was quiet, leaves scattered across manicured paths, the weight of the place settling around me like familiar silence. I found his headstone simple, understated, exactly what he would have chosen. I stood there for a long time, not speaking, just letting myself feel the presence of the man who had shaped my professional life more than anyone else. Finally, I told him about what had happened. I told him about Miranda's cruelty in that conference room, her certainty that I was disposable. I told him about Richard's blindness, his inability to see past family loyalty to the competence that actually ran his company. I told him about the founding clients who had rallied when they learned I'd been dismissed, about the bankruptcy filing that had backfired so spectacularly, about the courtroom moment when everything changed. And I told him the truth. I'd never spoken aloud to anyone. I almost walked away. After 15 years of being invisible, I almost accepted the termination, took my severance, and disappeared. The temptation was overwhelming to simply let go, to stop fighting for recognition that never came, to build a quiet life somewhere that didn't remind me daily of everything I'd contributed and everything that had been taken for granted. The only thing that stopped me was remembering what Edmund said the day he gave me the trust documents. Power isn't about titles, Vivian. It's about understanding systems well enough to protect the people who depend on them. Someday, my family will forget why I built this company. When that happens, you'll be the only one who remembers. I'd remembered. I'd waited. And when the moment came, I'd done exactly what he'd trusted me to do. Standing at his grave, I made a silent promise. I would protect what he built for as long as I was able. I would honor the partnerships he'd valued. I would ensure that competence mattered more than connection in the company that bore his name. And I would never forget what he taught me about invisible architecture, how the most important structures are often the ones nobody notices until someone tries to tear them down. My phone buzzed, breaking the quiet moment. A text from Douglas Pemberton. Board meeting next week. They're voting on the new strategic plan. Your presence is requested. And Vivian? Edmund would be proud. I read the message twice, letting the words settle around me like the autumn leaves. Edmund would be proud. That mattered more than anything else. The new board meeting was nothing like the ones I'd attended for 15 years, the ones where I sat in the background taking notes while other people made decisions I'd have to implement. This time, I sat at the main table, not at the head that wasn't my style, and it never would be, but at the table with a voice and a vote and the kind of presence that comes from being genuinely valued rather than merely tolerated. The strategic plan Trevor presented was thoughtful and sustainable, focused on maintaining relationships rather than disrupting them, on building competence-based leadership rather than family-appointed management. It was everything Edmund would have wanted, created by people who actually understood what they were managing. After the formal business concluded, I asked for a moment to address the board. "I have an announcement," I said, looking around the table at faces that had become familiar over recent months, some longtime colleagues, some new additions, all united by a shared commitment to doing better than what came before. I explained that I would be transferring the voting rights of Edmund's personal trust to a newly established foundation, the Edmund Harcourt Legacy Fund. The foundation would oversee scholarship programs for first-generation business students, people like I'd been 30 years ago, entering corporate environments without connections or pedigree. It would provide seed funding for entrepreneurs from overlooked backgrounds, supporting the kind of competence that too often goes unrecognized. I would retain my personal equity stake and my position on the Legacy Partnership Council, but the power Edmund had entrusted to me would now serve a broader purpose than just protecting a single company. It would help build a world where invisible architects didn't have to wait 15 years for their contributions to be acknowledged. The room applauded, but I barely noticed. My attention had drifted to the window, where morning light was streaming across the skyline Edmund had loved. I thought about Miranda, who had been escorted from the building with nothing but her personal items and a severance agreement that bought her silence. I thought about Richard, who now occupied a nominal advisor role with no authority and no respect, spending his days in an office that had been his father's but would never truly be his. I thought about the junior colleagues who had reached out after the transition, asking how they could build careers based on competence rather than connection. They wanted mentorship, guidance, reassurance that the system didn't have to be rigged against people like them. I thought about myself, the woman who had walked into this company at 28, invisible and underestimated, carrying student loans and a secondhand wardrobe, and absolutely no idea what she was capable of becoming. That woman hadn't imagined this moment. She hadn't dared to imagine it. But she'd done the work anyway. Day after day, year after year, building something that would eventually prove its own worth. And now I was here, in this room, at this table, in this life exactly where I was supposed to be. As the meeting concluded, Trevor approached with a folder in his hands. His expression was strange, not worried, exactly, but weighted with something I couldn't immediately identify. "There's something you should see," he said. "An old file we found during the restructuring. It's from Edmund's personal papers, a letter he wrote but never sent." I took the folder without asking questions. Some things needed to be discovered in their own time. I read the letter alone in my office, the corner office I'd finally accepted after declining it 3 times. The room was quiet, afternoon light falling across the desk Edmund had chosen for himself decades ago. The furniture had been moved when Richard took over the company, shuffled into storage along with everything else that reminded him of his father. I'd had it restored, not for sentiment, but because quality craftsmanship shouldn't be discarded simply because new leadership wants to feel modern. The letter was dated 3 weeks before Edmund's death. The handwriting was shakier than I remembered, the ink slightly smeared in places where his hand had trembled. He'd known he was dying, and he'd wanted to leave something behind that might never be found, or might be found at exactly the right moment. "Dear Vivian, if you're reading this, you've probably just saved my company from my family. I'm sorry I couldn't do it myself. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from the years of dismissal and disrespect I knew were coming." I stopped reading for a moment, letting those words settle. He'd known, of course he'd known. Edmund understood his children better than they understood themselves. He'd watched them grow up with every advantage and none of the discipline that gives advantage meaning. "But I need you to understand something. This was never about revenge. This was about trust. I trusted you because you never asked for recognition. You simply did the work that needed to be done, day after day, year after year, while my children and their children climbed over each other for positions they hadn't earned. You were the foundation they never noticed. And foundations don't need applause. They just need to remain standing when everything above them starts to crumble." I read those words 3 times, feeling something shift in my chest. All those years of invisibility, of wondering whether my contributions actually mattered, of lying awake at night questioning whether I was fooling myself about my own value, Edmund had seen all of it. He'd understood. And he'd built safeguards specifically because he knew I would need them. "Whatever happens next is yours to decide. Lead if you want to lead. Advise if you want to advise. Walk away if you want to walk away. You've earned every option. But please, don't forget what you taught me. Power built on family names can be taken away by boardroom votes. Power built on genuine competence and real relationships, that's the only kind that lasts. With gratitude, admiration, and trust, Edmund Harcourt. P.S. Tell Douglas I still owe him $20 from our last poker game. He'll know what that means." I laughed at the postscript, the kind of laugh that's really just tears finding another way out. Edmund had played poker with Douglas Pemberton for 40 years. The $20 debt was a running joke between them, never paid because paying it would have ended the game. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer beside the pen Edmund had given me all those years ago. 2 gifts from the same man, spanning 15 years, one marking the beginning of my journey, one marking its culmination. I used to think power meant being seen, being recognized, being credited for the work I did, and the relationships I maintained, and the systems I built. I spent years believing that invisibility was a punishment, that if I just worked harder and stayed longer and proved myself more thoroughly, eventually someone would notice. But sitting in that office, holding Edmund's letter, I understood something different. Real power is knowing your own worth so completely that you don't need anyone else to confirm it. Real power is building something so structurally sound that it survives even when people try to tear it down. Real power is having the choice to stay, to leave, to lead, or to simply watch, and knowing that every choice belongs to you. Edmund gave me that power not because he thought I needed protection, but because he knew I would use it wisely. He trusted me with the architecture of his company's future because he'd watched me build architecture for 15 years, relationship by relationship, system by system, foundation by invisible foundation. The people who underestimated me didn't know what I was capable of. They saw a quiet woman in sensible shoes, someone who showed up early and stayed late and never complained, and they assumed that reliability meant weakness. But I knew. I always knew. And now, everyone else knew too. I spent a long time in that office as the afternoon stretched into evening, the city lights coming on one by one outside the windows. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, the compromises and the patience and the strategic silences, the moments when I wanted to scream and the moments when I wanted to walk away. I thought about the young colleagues who were watching how I handled power now that I had it. They were learning lessons I wish someone had taught me at their age. That competence matters, that relationships matter, that doing the right thing matters, even when no one is watching. And I thought about what comes next. The company Edmund built would survive. The partnerships he valued would continue. The foundation I'd established in his name would help people who reminded me of who I used to be, invisible and underestimated and capable of more than anyone bothered to imagine. That was enough. That was more than enough. I picked up my phone and texted Douglas Pemberton. The letter says you're owed $20. He says you'll know what that means. The response came almost immediately. I always knew I'd collect eventually. Drinks Friday? We should talk about the future. The future. Such a simple word for such a complex thing. I'd spent 15 years building a future without knowing whether I'd ever see it. I'd laid foundations and maintained relationships and protected institutional knowledge without any guarantee that my work would matter in the end. But it mattered. Edmund made sure it would matter. And now the future was mine to shape in whatever way I chose. I stood at the window. Looking out at the skyline, Edmund had loved the buildings he'd watched go up, the city he'd helped grow, the world he'd navigated with equal measures of ambition and integrity. I'm Vivian Ashford. I was invisible for 15 years. I was underestimated, overlooked, dismissed by people who assumed that competence without pedigree must be worthless. But I built something that outlasted their assumptions. I protected something that their arrogance tried to destroy. And when the moment came when everything I'd worked for hung in the balance, I was ready. Edmund was right about me. He was right about power. And he was right about one more thing. Something I'd finally learned after all these years. Foundations don't need applause. They just have to stay standing long enough for the truth to become undeniable. The truth is undeniable now. And I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be.